Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Hello there, folks. Okay, so we're back here today, and we're going to be talking about Scottish independence, UK, and we're going to be talking about something called the Barnett Formula. Now, so that everybody understands, you guys may have seen in a previous video where I basically I talked about the fact that the UK had been dumping waste and weapons and things in the Beaufort Dyke and everything, and ended up getting that there was paperwork that was connecting the Scottish office to this decision, apparently, and all these sort of things. Well, the Scottish office is a arm of Westminster. It's fully an arm of Westminster, and that will I'll be talking about them a little bit during this video. And what you saw in one of the tweets in that video where it talked about that the UK gives Scotland something like, I think it said something like $1,900, a little over pounds per head in Scotland, and that ends up equaling about $10 billion that the UK gives Scotland. Okay, and this is all done according to something called the Barnett Formula. Okay, the start of this video, folks, I want to just say one thing right off the bat, right? United Kingdom is a what? It's a nation. It's a country. It's a United Kingdom, right? So, who is it that would be paying for the public services in their United Kingdom if there weren't devolved parliaments? Who would be responsible for paying that? Westminster, right? So the thing that I have a problem with here is the way that they use that money as like it's like some kind of free gift that they're just giving away to Scotland. It's like, no, you're only giving that to Scotland because it's kind of your responsibility. And if you had been managing your United Kingdom better, you wouldn't have devolved parliaments. Honestly, if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, you wouldn't have, if you were running your United Kingdom, well, you wouldn't have devolved parliaments, and you wouldn't have Scotland voting in the SNP. I mean, think of how many seats were lost by all the other parties in Britain, in the UK. Okay? The Conservatives lost like 7 seats. Labour lost like 7 seats. The Lib Dems had 1. They lost that seat, and 13 new members have been voted in to Parliament now. SNP members. That's what Scotland did in the most recent election. So this really goes to show that Westminster hasn't learned from the past, and all of the landmass that Britain used to control, and they haven't learned anything from losing all that, because they can't even manage the affairs of the United Kingdom, and that's the honest truth of it. So this money that they like to act like as if it's some kind of free gift that they just give out of the kindness of their hearts, and that the Scots are just ungrateful. No. As long as you're going to keep them in the UK, you're responsible for funding public services. Dude, are you kidding me? So, all right, having said that, what does the Barnett Formula actually do? Like, what is it really doing? Like, what's the point of it, right? Okay. So that's what the point of this video is going to be. We're going to see what the actual goal of the Barnett Formula really is. Okay. So what you have is this Barnett Formula. It was created back in the 70s, okay, by a guy named Barnett, who was the chairman of the UK Treasury or whatever at the time and stuff. He wrote this formula and everything, and it got applied. Now, this was in 78, I believe, and it was all in anticipation of 1979, there was going to be a vote for devolved parliaments and everything in 1979. Well, here's the funny thing about that, folks. It actually got voted in. It actually the having devolved parliaments actually won in democratic terms, right? But then Westminster added a stipulation, basically, saying that a certain percentage of the people in Scotland had to vote yes. What that essentially did is because only 61% of the population turned out to vote, only 61%, so the percentage of people that voted yes ended up being less than the percentage that Westminster deemed was necessary. And so the devolved parliaments were denied in 1979. They eventually came by. They came later. But so that's what the Barnett Formula was anticipation of, is how the money would be distributed to the devolved parliaments in the UK. So there's an equation. I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to show you from a financial analyst who I've covered here before. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to his other video down below, because it's going to be very, very pertinent for people to understand how much the oil in Scotland is truly subsidizing the UK. So it's a very interesting video that I will leave below. So one thing that the Unionists and people in Westminster will always say is that England is subsidizing Scotland by giving them this, block grant each year. But as I said before, you can't say it's a gift for something that you're responsible to fund in the first place, right? You're the one that won't let them out of the UK, so it's your responsibility by your choice. So quit acting like it's some great gift that you're giving them out of the kindness of your heart, because that's just bull. Anyways, so it's meant to, so what it does is it's meant to fund public services. So how it works is each year England itself will it will give itself it will basically allot itself a certain amount of more money that year to be able to fund public services and stuff like that. Well, so what happens is that England, gets this much amount, but then the Barnett Formula is applied to determine what percentage of that total will the other parliaments get. And so that's what the Barnett Formula works out, and it basically works out to where it gives less money than it to those, to Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland than England gets. It's essentially a way to kind of cut down how much money the other devolved parliaments get, in a way. So and you'll see that illustrated in the article that I'm going to show you. One other thing I want to point out, because I brought up the oil, and this is something I think Scots really need to think about, is you can see the way Westminster is acting now. And that's with you having oil, which they are relying heavily on. Just imagine how much worse it can get if that runs out, and and if Scotland didn't take charge of it before it ran out, and then it runs out, and you're at Westminster's mercy. Do you want to be at Westminster's mercy? So that's something that occurs to me when I'm looking at all this stuff, because so far in 3 months of looking into this, when I started out in the beginning thinking, whoa, Scotland should look before they leap. Scotland should look before they leap. Whoa. Hey, no, you don't want to get too crazy here. You don't want to be hasty, right? That was my attitude. But since in that 3 months, I have not once yet seen anything from Westminster that tells me that they got their head in the game. Westminster did not seem to have their head in the game. Every indicator I see tells me that. It's just, there's no way to support something like that, because it's just bizarre, the things that I see there. And it's unfortunate. So, like I said, I think Scots really need to really take a serious look at this, because seriously, you don't want that oil to run out and then have Westminster cutting back. And I mean, you don't want to be at Westminster's mercy at that point. Something that occurs to me. So, all right, we're gonna go ahead and show you right now. I'm gonna show you basically the equation and how it kind of works, so that you can understand the way that the funding is kind of calculated. So here we go. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the formula for calculating how much money the devolved parliaments get from Westminster every year. So it basically comes down to this: the extra funding for Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland is basically equal to these three things. Okay, so the first thing is the actual amount of extra funding going to England, right? Okay, so that money there is then taken and it's times by the population proportion compared to England. So, for instance, in Scotland, if you look down in the first line down here in the text, basically it says there the percentages. Well, I'll read it here. For example, in 2000, the Northern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh populations were taken to be 3.69% for Northern Ireland, 10.34% for Scotland, and 5.93% for Wales. Okay, so what that means is that you would start with the extra funding for England, times it by, for Scotland, 10.34, and when you do, that gives you approximately 103 million pounds, which is a lot less than $1 billion, because that's what they're figuring the extra funding for England is. They're saying if England gives itself $1 billion extra that year, then you take what England's getting, times it by basically 10%, and yeah, so and then you times it by 10%, and then you come up with 103 million, which is quite a bit less than what England's getting, right? But this is based on population, right? So Scotland ends up with 103 million there, and then you got to take that, and that's where you figure in the third factor up here, the extent to which the relevant English department program is comparable with the services carried out by the devolved administration. What that means is how much control does the devolved parliament have over that particular public service? So the way that works out is that it happens. So let's take the NHS, the National Health System, for instance. In Scotland, the devolved parliament has almost full control of the NHS, so they get 100%. So in terms of the NHS, Scotland would then get, first of all, it started out at $1 billion extra funding for England, but then they times $1 billion by the 10.34% population, because that's, if you compare, Scotland's population is equal to 10.34% of England's population, right? So that's where they come up with that 10.34%, and then you times $1 billion by 10.34, you get 103 million. You take the 103 million, and because Scotland has 100%, pretty much 100% control of the NHS, you take that 103 million times 100%, which is just going to give you 103 million. Now, if it's a different public service, let's say it was something else that say has 50%, the devolved parliament has 50% of control of it, then you would take the 103 million, obviously, which is the 1 billion times 10.34, and then you times that by 50%. Well, then you'd come up with something like 51.5 million instead of 103 million. So it also depends on how much control the devolved parliament has. And another thing to keep in mind is that between 1979 and I think 2014, or I think it was 2014 when the devolved parliaments began, but between that time, this block grant money was being distributed by the Scottish office, which I've explained before to be a arm of Westminster, So for a long time, because the devolved parliaments didn't come about in 1979 as many people anticipated and expected, thanks to the moving of the bar essentially by Westminster, for a long time there wasn't devolved parliaments, but the Barnett Formula was still being used, and so that money just went to the Scottish office at that time. But when devolved parliaments actually did come around, then the Barnett Formula was applied properly, the way it was meant to be applied. So, but the problem is that the Barnett Formula is actually set up to decrease spending in the countries or the parts of the United Kingdom with devolved parliaments. It's actually meant to curb the money they get in a sense. And you'll see that explained in the article here. So, all right, we'll move on back to that now. Okay, so this is from an article called the Barnett Formula Myth. It does not subsidize Scotland. So it's written by Gordon McIntyre Kemp. So here he's the gentleman that I am putting the video below, who I did a video of his article about the oil in Scotland. So I suggest people check that out and see what he was saying there, because it really is that Scotland with its oil is truly subsidizing the UK, not the other way around. But anyway, arguably the most misunderstood part of the UK public sector budgeting mechanism is the Barnett Formula. The vast majority of people, politicians, and media seem to think that Barnett represents a subsidy to Scotland. Many Westminster MPs, mainly Conservatives, have described it as English taxpayers subsidizing Scottish public spending, and the mainstream media have run headlines along those lines. There is just one little problem with that idea. It's complete and utter nonsense. The Barnett Formula was introduced as a funding mechanism containing a mathematical formula that aimed to reduce Scottish funding in comparison to England's. To understand why it exists and how it was supposed to reduce Scotland's public spending, we need to understand the Scotland of the 1970s, when it was first introduced. The Barnett Formula's predecessor, the Goshen Formula, had been used between 1889 and 1959, before budget negotiations by secretaries of state became the norm. Scotland was an industrial powerhouse, and its economy and public sector revenues generated meant that the secretaries of state for Scotland had real negotiating power in budget discussions. The Barnett Formula was first devised in 1978 as a temporary response to the potential devolution of powers to a Scottish Parliament after the 1979 devolution referendum, and thus Barnett would replace the annual budget negotiations. The referendum result saw 51.6% of voters in Scotland voting for devolution. However, fearing that would happen, a Labour MP for an English constituency successfully tabled an amendment to the Referendum Act that stipulated that more than 40% of the total Scottish electorate would have to vote yes in the referendum for devolution to be enacted. Even though the result was 51.6% yes, the turnout was only 64%. So as a percentage of the total electorate, only 32.9% voted yes. And so despite winning the referendum, devolution was denied to the people of Scotland at that point. Fearing a collapse of influence in future budget negotiations, consecutive Scottish Secretaries of State argued to maintain the Barnett Formula, as they knew that, at least in the short term, it would maintain Scottish public sector spending at higher levels per head than in England. The Treasury, presumably understanding the mathematics of the formula, knew that over time it would reduce real terms spending in Scotland to parity with English levels, was only too happy to agree. The Barnett Formula has not succeeded, though, in reducing Scotland's public spending. The reason it remains higher to this day is largely due to unforeseen devolution complications that undermined the Barnett Formula's goal. That is why many Westminster politicians want to replace it with a formula that would presumably be more effective at cutting Scotland's budget. So, yeah, they just want to keep cutting Scotland, How does the Barnett Formula work? Scottish public sector revenues are collected by the UK and Scottish governments and sent to the UK Treasury. Spending reviews take place, normally over 5-year periods, and when the budget for England is completed, the Barnett Formula is applied. This aims to give each country the same pounds per person change in funding as the change in funding for comparable government services in England. Then, based on that calculation, the Scottish government receives a block grant from the Treasury with which to fund the expenditure it is responsible for under devolution. This block grant is not in any way based on the needs of Scotland or on the levels of revenue generated in Scotland. The Barnett Formula at its simplest. So I was explaining this a bit before, but it's whatever the additional funding is given to England. So hypothetically, let's say $1 billion, right? Then we take that and we times it by the amount or the comparison of Scotland's population to England, which ends up that Scotland has approximately about the same as little over 10% of England's population. So we take the 1 billion times the 10.3 or whatever, we get 100 or 10.03, and we get $103 million. And then if we're talking about the NHS, then we know we take that and we times it by 99.7, I believe it is. Sorry. And then you end up getting whatever the extra funding is for the NHS that gets added to the block grant that you're seeing here. So that's basically what happens. So it's based on population and everything, but it's also meant, you'll see here in a minute, how it's meant to kind of curb Scotland's spending and keep them from getting the same percentage that England gets. I mean, it's knocking down, from 3.4. If England's getting a 3.4% raise for its own public services each year, that 3.4% isn't translating to Scotland. It's less. So, and that's because of the way the Barnett formula works. It's fairly simple, and the comparability factor, purple box, is, again, in simple terms, the percentage amount of the budget responsibility devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So, like I said, with health, with the NHS, it's like 99.7% is devolved to the Scottish Parliament. With other health services, it's more like maybe 50% and stuff like that. So you have to do the calculation on like each public service as it pertains to how much control the Parliament, the devolved Parliament in question, has over that public service. So that's what the purple is just they're only going to, if you're only in charge of 50% of that public service, they're only going to send you funding for 50% of that, essentially, is what that's saying. When Westminster makes all the decisions, the comparability factor is 0. How it works in practice. So, in terms of health, for example, the UK government announced plans to increase spending on the NHS by an average of 3.4% in every year for the 5-year period starting with 2018 and 2019 and ending with the year 2022 and 2023. So the increases in England health spending will be, you can see here where they in 2018 and 19 it was 114 billion 600 million whatever, right? So 114.6 billion, right? That is a 3.9 billion increase. So you add this to this and you get this the next year. This is the base number. So you go 3.4%. That ends up being 4.03. You see how it's higher than this number? That's because this number keeps growing every time it goes up 3.4%. Right? So ultimately, there in 2022 and 2023, it ends up being 4.45 billion, almost 4.5 billion, when it was under 4 billion, right? Starting out. So this is how it works, right? It's a 3.4% percentage that England gets. That's it. It's just a percentage, they get that, right? But through the Barnett formula, it works out differently. The Barnett formula is then applied, which takes the increase in England and multiplies it first by the comparability percentage, which is the amount of funding for areas that are that are devolved, and in health that is 99.4%. Then it multiplies that figure by Scotland's population share of England's population, which is 9.85% in this article. So, thus the resultant increases in NHS spending in Scotland from that spending review will be as follows. So you can see they start out at 0.381 billion here on their first one. When, just look up here, when England was at 3.9. So you know England's getting the full percentage. Scotland is not getting the full percentage. After going through the Barnett Formula is shaving it down and giving the Scots less. So it's interesting. And it goes on and on. So in 2018-19, the spending on Scotland's health budget would increase by £381 million. The increase will generate larger numbers every year because, although the rise will always be 3.4%, the base year will always be larger than the year before. Now you think that when England's NHS rises by 3.4%, so should Scotland's. However, the Barnett Formula was not designed to mean a rise in England's spending would be passed on in percentage terms in Scotland. That would be such a simple calculation, it would hardly need a formula or a fancy name. So let us see what happens if the Barnett Formula just gives Scotland's NHS budget the same percentage increase as England is getting as a result of the review, namely 3.4%. And so here you can see the difference in the numbers. Right here, starting out at 0.45 billion. Going up each year, obviously, because this gets bigger and bigger each time there's an increase, right? But this is what Scotland actually gets through the Barnett Formula. 0.3, 0.3, 0.4, 0.4, right? So here, 0.4, 0.4, 0.4, 0.4, 0.5, right? I mean, so you can see that the Barnett Formula is not giving Scotland or any of the other devolved parliaments 3.4%. It's cutting them back. It's shaving it back. So that's, to me, quite interesting. As you can see, the Barnett Formula does not pass on the full 3.4%. In fact, over the 5-year period, the cumulative increase in Scotland's budget under the Barnett Formula is about 2.04 billion. But if the English percentage increase was applied, the cumulative budget improvement would have been 2.39 billion, a whole 343 million higher across the 5 years. Let's be clear. The Barnett Formula means that in the budget areas where it applies, spending in Scotland is reduced on a percentage basis in comparison to the increases received in England. Why does this happen? Well, Scotland's health budget per head is larger than England's. It always has been. And so the per head calculation means the increase overall will result in a smaller percentage increase in total budget in Scotland. This is known as the Barnett Squeeze, and proves that the Barnett Formula has a built-in mechanism to lower Scottish government spending till it reaches parity with England's. Should Scotland's health budget be higher per head than England's? Well, given Westminster has run a policy of deindustrialization and financialization, causing population growth to be slower in Scotland, and indeed in other smaller home nations, then you have fewer people, lower population density, and an aging population and higher levels of poverty. Then there is a justifiable need to spend more. Add that to the fact that, as proven in our accounting trick articles, Scotland in reality subsidizes the rest of the UK. That's the one about the oil, folks. So like I said, that's down below. It seems a bit dishonest to devise a formula to cut that vital health spending and then tell the Scottish people that the formula is a boost or a bonus to their nation, which they can't afford to live without. The Barnett Formula has the same impact across many of Scotland's most important spending areas. But let's finish by considering the real-world impact to Scotland's health spending by illustrating what the missing 343 million of budget increases denied to Scotland's NHS across the 5 years would pay for. If Scotland were to have received the full 3.4% increase, as in England, then looking at the average of the salary ranges published in the April of 2019 for medical staff, and Scottish NHS would have been able to hire 972 new general practitioners, 3,756 new healthcare assistants, 750 additional consultant doctors, 1,447 nurse consultants, and 1,030 consultant paramedics. Conclusion: in stark terms, and only looking at one of many devolved expenditure areas, the Barnett Formula will withhold from Scotland over the 5 years covered by the spending review enough money to have hired approximately 7,955 additional NHS medical professionals. That is not a bonus. It is a smoke and mirrors mechanism that aims to reduce the Scottish government spending power in real terms. All right, so that's what Barnett is basically all about. It's meant to allot the money according to what control the devolved parliaments have over that public service, essentially, and among other things. But as you can see, it's clearly shaving back what it gives to some of the smaller home nations. You see, whereas there is 0% differential in England, because Westminster is in England. That's it. There's no devolved anything. So there's zero differential, right? So, but with the other nations, because there's devolved parliaments and stuff, it's different. It's there, but always Westminster's maintaining some control, as you can see with the health services at 99.4, and also in the other thing I showed you from Wikipedia where it was 99.7. So that's a large amount, but Westminster's still holding on to that 0.6 or 0.3. You know what I mean? And not all the public services does the Scottish Parliament have that kind of power. Now, it is being discussed. One of the possible things being discussed, specifically in the Labour Party, they're talking about as like an alternative to independence, for the Scottish Parliament to be given like full devolvement powers, and just basically pushing devolvement to the max, right? So that is one potential, thing being offered, or potential plan being offered as a alternative to independence. I honestly don't see a case for it. I don't see a case for being in the Union. So ultimately, what I want to wrap up with saying is, I think Scotland really, really needs to take a look. And I hope the people really do start to get an education. I hope the SNP really does start to spread awareness of some of the things going on. I obviously do my best, but I'm just some daft dude from California, and so I'm not really getting a lot of credibility on this one. So hey, but just like with the other topic that I cover on my other channel, I build the credibility as I go. So, but here is basically somebody from the outside looking in and taking a look at this, judging by the oil and the fact that Scotland is actually bringing a third of the natural resources to the table in the UK, when they're actually only about 9 or 10%, or they're only, a small percentage of the population of the UK. I think, 8.5% of the UK. And it's a small area, but yet it's bringing that much of the natural resources to the table. That could all be under the control of the Scottish government, and allow the Scottish government to choose its own path. Because Westminster is only going to ever want to do what Westminster wants to do. I don't believe Westminster cares much for the Scots. Okay, and you can see that in the fact that the way that they represent the money given to Scotland, that because of the Barnett Formula, Scotland receives an extra whatever, $1,900 per head in Scotland or whatever. It's like, no, it's not an extra. It's not an extra. It's the money that Westminster would have been paying if they had been running their United Kingdom right and weren't causing the various parts of their kingdom to want to take their affairs into their own hands because they didn't feel Westminster was capable. See? If that situation didn't exist, there wouldn't be devolved parliaments, and Westminster is responsible as daddy. They don't want to let the Scots out of the UK. They don't want to allow them to have their referendum. Well, they're responsible for the Scots so long as they obstruct Indy Ref 2. So that's the way I see it. It's disturbing to watch the way that they represent that money. And then you hear people, like I've seen on video, I've shown it on videos here before, where you see people on TV and stuff like that saying Scotland ain't got no money. Scotland this and that, blah 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 blah. Scotland only has money because the UK gives them money. You see it on UK television. I've seen it. And the fact is that the UK, a lot of its wealth comes from the resources that come from Scotland. And that's just money that's just money for public services. The only reason it's actually given to the Scottish Parliament is because it's the powers of that on those public services are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Yeah. It's not any gift or anything like that. It's none of those things. And trust me, if Scotland were to take control of its own natural resources, its oil, and all those sort of things, you wouldn't need the Barnett Formula. I'm serious. There would be no need for the Barnett Formula. It would be completely obsolete and stupid. Scotland, and I encourage everybody to go below and check out the link about the oil in Scotland, by the same gentleman that wrote the article that we covered today. But I advise everybody to go check that out and see how really Scotland with its oil is subsidizing the UK. It's actually the other way around. It's not the UK subsidizing Scotland. Scotland is subsidizing the UK with its natural resources, which oil is one of. Right? So I hope the Scots realize that, once that oil runs out, if you don't take control of it before it runs out, and you're left at the mercy of Westminster, and the oil runs out, and Westminster isn't going to want to be, paying as much money out for Scotland without the oil there. Do you want to be at their mercy then? Be like, please, sir, can I have another? I mean, yeah, I don't know. For me, that's a very, very grim reality, possible reality or outcome. And I hope the Scots do something to prevent it. So, all right, that is my video today about the Barnett Formula. Check out the video about Scotland's oil down below. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.